Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle and welcome to the National Parks Expedition Challenge. Today we're in Andersonville, Georgia at the Andersonville National Historic Site. Just look around me at this beautiful setting we're in, and we're here with park guide Ranger Davis. Thanks so much for having us here today.
Of course.
So how did you come to this park?
So I've been with the National Park Service since 2016. I actually started as an intern while I was in grad school at the University of West Georgia, and had previously gone to undergraduate school at Georgia Southwestern, just down the street in Americus. And so I was working with Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park as an intern, and then I got a seasonal position with the Boston Harbor Islands after finishing grad school. So I was there for about 4 seasons until I came on as a permanent ranger here at Andersonville back in August of 2020.
2020, right during the pandemic.
Yep.
So everything sort of shut down. So tell us a little bit about this place. When did it become a park, and why is it significant?
So Andersonville National Historic Site became a park in 1970. Prior to that, it had been in control of the Army, and then prior to that, it was under the control of the Grand Army of the Republic and then the Women's Relief Corps, which the Grand Army of the Republic was the Union's veterans organization that formed after the Civil War, and then the Women's Relief Corps was the Women's Auxiliary, and it became a park in order to interpret the Andersonville Prison, or Camp Sumner, in which over the course of the 14 months the prison was open, a total of 45,000 men are going to pass through the gates, Union soldiers, and of those 45,000 men, a total of 13,000 are going to die as a result of the conditions here. That's a death rate of about 29%. It is the highest death rate of any prison, and higher in terms of death rate than any battles that had been fought during the war as well. So the site helps to commemorate those men and kind of tell the story of the Andersonville prison.
When you walk around the grounds, what are you going to find here at this site?
The grounds are sort of kind of laid out how the prison would have been. There aren't, the only real historical structures are the earthworks, which are behind us here. But the rest is reconstruction. So you've got the reconstruction of the northern gate just down that way, which is where the prisoners would have come in. And then you've got the reconstruction of the northeast corner over that way, which is a reconstruction of when the camp was expanded in July of 1864 due to overcrowding. So visitors can, kind of see some of this, get a sense of what things would have been like based on these reconstructions, and then sort of the rest is kind of denoting where the prison walls would have been, where the stockade walls would have been, as well as the deadline, which is denoted by these white posts that are up by the road. And then, of course, we've got the monuments that are here that would have been dedicated and constructed after the war, when the Women's Relief Corps had control of the park in about the 1890s to early 1900s.
How big is this property?
So the prison site itself, when it first opened, was about 16 acres. It was expanded to 26 acres. So all around where you see either the post or the stone corners is a total of about 26.5 acres.
So we see a lot of monuments around here. Tell us about these.
So each one of these monuments was dedicated by specific states. So any state that had lost men that were here, for example, this monument here is the Wisconsin monument. So a group, the Grand Army of the Republic group from Wisconsin, came down after the war, and they were working with the Women's Relief Corps, who again had control of the property, to dedicate these monuments in order to honor those who had died, those men from their states that had died here as a result of their imprisonment.
What is this one behind us?
So this one's Massachusetts, and then the obelisk is Ohio.
Ohio. Now, when we first came into the site, we came through a visitor center, and I noticed there was a museum. What can we find in there?
So the museum is the National Prisoner of War Museum. It is the only museum in the country that interprets all the prisoner of war experience throughout the nation's history. The museum opened in 1998, so it interprets the prisoner of war experience from the Revolutionary War all the way up to the then current Gulf War, and it's not specific in terms of, it doesn't really interprets prisoner of war experience, but kind of an overarching prisoner of war experience. It's not broken up between specific wars. It kind of goes through the whole experience and tries to interpret it really from the human level of the experience.
When people come here, what does this park want to convey to them?
I would say between the museum as well as the park, the service and sacrifice of those who had been imprisoned, whether they be the Union prisoners that were held here or prisoners of war that were held throughout our nation's history, whether it be at the very beginning from the Revolutionary War or the Vietnam War, which is a pretty key focus of the museum, or all the way up to the then current Gulf War, so more modern prisoners as well.
Have you had any special events here or celebrations or memorials?
So we actually did just have one for Memorial Day. We every Memorial Day put out flags, and we have it's generally Boy Scout groups that do it, but occasionally it is other groups like the Warner Robins Jeep group came down, and some individual volunteer citizens as well helped to put out flags. And we had a bagpiper come and play Amazing Grace, and he came down from the rostrum, which is where we do our funerals because we're still an active cemetery, and played Amazing Grace and walked through the cemetery. And then we had a bugler come and play taps at 3 o'clock, which 3 o'clock is the National Day of Reverence for throughout the entire country for Memorial Day.
So tell us about the cemetery. How many people are interned there?
So it's about 2,200 at this point, and it's still an active cemetery. So from the time that the prisoners that had died here were buried in the cemetery, they'll be buried throughout the entire 14 months that the camp is open. But after the war, it still continues as a veteran cemetery. So to this day, any veteran who is honorably discharged can be buried, as well as their spouses and certain dependents as well. And we do about 200 burials a year.
So I'm assuming there's people that come to that, I guess family members, and then they have the gun salutes. And I don't know a lot about the military funerals, but I've seen, several at Arlington. So you have sort of the same type of...
Correct. So honor guards are something that family members could do for their relatives as well.
So this is a very reverent place, hallowed ground, because people did die here. Is there a story that you could tell us about this place?
So I would say one of the most inspiring things, and something that people often go visit, is Providence Spring, which is just beyond the northern gate there. And there is a structure over Providence Spring. Providence Spring occurred in August of 1864. At the very beginning, August was the deadliest month. There were a total of 33,000 men in the camp in August. That's the highest number at one time, and a total of 3,000 men will die in that 1 month alone. But at the very beginning of the month, there was a torrential downpour, and in fact, it was so bad that it washed out part of the stockade. But there was also really bad lightning, and there was a lightning strike that hit just around the deadline around that way. And clean water came bubbling up. The prisoners more or less did not have any clean water because all of the water that was supplied to them through Stockade Branch was contaminated, because the guards had their command posts as well as their cookhouse upstream. So all that uncontaminated water was running down into where the prisoners were supposed to drink. So obviously it was not clean for them to drink, but the lightning strike actually caused a spring to come up. It was believed maybe that it's possible that the spring was already there and had been unintentionally buried, because it was near the stockade wall, so it could have been unintentionally buried when the stockade was being built. But it helped to save a couple of hundred lives, and the prisoners referred to it as Providence Spring because they saw it as a divine providence from God. And that's one thing. The spring still runs, so visitors can go down and see the water coming out. There's also a pool that kind of overflows into the water that was there, so it's pretty powerful to be able to see that kind of small miracle in what was a pretty terrible place for a lot of people.
So I would love to walk around a little bit and just see what is here, especially inside your museum. Is that okay?
Okay,
let's do it.
Of course. When construction began on this museum right before 1998, when it finally opened, kind of the vision was telling the whole prisoner of war experience, especially, and I think the Vietnam War had a lot to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam War brought a lot of new recognition to prisoners of war that hadn't really been recognized before, and that's for a lot of different factors. Obviously, you've got a lot of you have a lot of prisoners, and you've got people like Sybil Stockdale, whose husband James Bond Stockdale was one of the highest held prisoners of war during the entire war. She advocated, for telling the prisoner of war experience and trying to really focus on that. So I think kind of that coming to light helped kind of bring about a lot of this new recognition of prisoners of war. Yeah, so the museum kind of starts with defining what POWs actually are, which can be more than just those who are captured in combat. You've also had POWs, particularly during like World War II, that were civilians, whether they be like civilian contractors or even just civilians that were in the area. There was a group of nurses in the Philippines during World War II that were captured and held as prisoners. So they were with the Army, but they weren't full-time soldiers. And so you've got a lot of different categories of prisoners, and this section of the museum kind of talks about that.
So this is a good graphic that just sort of says from the Revolutionary War all the way up to now.
Right, yeah, so kind of the timeline of prisoners of war, and it even goes up into the first prisoners of war during the 21st century, held during the Iraq War in 2003. Here we kind of get a little bit more into the prisoner of war experience, and it begins as if someone were to be captured first year, this would be the area. If someone was captured, this would be captured, as you can tell by the interactives here, and then this next section is known as Journey to the Camp, so as they're being brought into the prison itself. And we have some prisoner of war stories that'll show up here on the interactive here.
So many people died here, but was that lack of food? Were they abused?
It was a combination of factors. It checked off all their boxes when they opened the camp. They thought, oh, we'll have plenty of food. We're sort of in like the breadbasket of the state. You've got what is known as Stockade Branch, which is the creek running through the center of the camp. But when they got here by May, there were a total of 10,000 men in the camp, which was their cap of how many men they could have held in the camp. So you're already over how many men are here, and it wasn't as easy to get food as they thought. They would try to get food from Columbus, which is, only, a little over an hour away, probably about 50, 60 miles, but it was hard to do that. And at this point, 1864, the Confederacy doesn't even have enough food to feed their own soldiers, let alone...
And they're not going to give away their food.
Right, and kind of that combined with the command structure, and even though Henry Wirtz, who was the commander of the camp, was charged and convicted of war crimes and ultimately hanged, and was the only person hanged during the Civil War, it was kind of a combination of him not necessarily doing his job, but also not having the resources. To really do his job. Yeah. This image here, this is some prisoners that were held during Korea. The Korean War is often seen as the forgotten war because it was in between.
Right.
You've got the United States' big victory in the Second World War, and then you've got obviously the tragic defeat in the Vietnam War. So the Korean War kind of gets sandwiched in between, but there are plenty of prisoners who were captured, and many of whom are still alive to this day.
So these artifacts, I know each of them has like their own little story, but as we see this stuff all over the country, it's neat to see the stories of how the national parks acquire them. Like people come forward and say, hey, I have a relative that was a POW and I have this from them, and then they just give it to the parks? Is that sort of the way it goes?
Yeah, so it's kind of a process of, because we do have a curator on site, so we actually have someone who has, and she's got artifacts in her office that obviously some are sometimes on display and some are not, so it's sort of a process of helping to sort of incorporate it into the story. We actually have two artifacts at the very beginning of the hall that are sort of temporary artifacts that were donated by a gentleman was actually a POW during the Vietnam War. And he actually came to speak maybe a month ago. So kind of his artifacts, and kind of because he's able to sort of tell those stories himself, that's one of the reasons, why those artifacts are out.
So many jobs within the national parks.
Yeah.
Like, if there were kids out there right now that were interested in jobs, what would you suggest they do while they're still in school?
I would say start as soon as possible. If it's something you think you're interested in, definitely try and get an internship. That's what I did. And after my internship, I decided, all right, this is what I want to do for my career. And so definitely try that. And it kind of there are certain, schools, places like Gettysburg College that, have programs for that. Or, I mean, even just like when I was at Fredericksburg in Spotsylvania, I was a grad student at West Georgia, so was able to kind of get in there, and definitely making your connections,
Right.
Talking to people, both to kind of figure out their own experiences, and sort of everyone has their own ways of getting in. You could also, be a volunteer as well, which is something that even as a student, as a teenager, you can, anyone can volunteer. And I've worked with, volunteers that are younger, that are like in high school, so definitely
I know you're even supervising some interns now that are here. What was your degree? How did you get in?
So when I was at Georgia Southwestern, I got a degree in history, and then when I was at the University of West Georgia, I got my master's in history with a concentration in public history.
Oh.
So a little bit more focused on kind of this side, and showing the history to the public.
Right, being that interpreter of.
Right, as opposed to kind of focusing more on academics.
Getting into parks, is it pretty competitive?
It is pretty competitive, but I think it's one of those things where if you kind of start early like that,
Right.
It makes it a lot easier.
So when a state wants to come in and honor, do they apply for land to be able to put up a monument, or?
So for those that were placed on the site, they were just allowed to come in because the Women's Relief Court gave them access to the site too, and they just had to basically send a delegation down to sort of dedicate. They would have more often than not made the monuments like in their states or from their materials. Like the Massachusetts monument is all made from Quincy granite, which would have come from Quincy, Massachusetts, and then they would have brought down,
celebrated or represented their
the monuments, and had the members of the Grand Army of the Republic from that chapter dedicate the monuments with the Women's Relief Corps.
Do any active groups come in and ask to erect something for their people?
No, so our last monument was actually the Georgia Monument, which was erected in 1971. So actually when Jimmy Carter was governor, and that was erected as a way to kind of tell the prisoner of war experience through all wars up until that point, kind of going beyond the Civil War as well.
Let's talk about our STEM challenge. As you know, normally we have a build at the end of each of our STEM challenges, but today we're going to encourage you to look out in your community and find people that have served in the military. There may be POWs, prisoners of war, in your area. There's definitely going to be veterans there. What can you do to make their lives better? How can you be compassionate? Could you help work with your parents or the people you live with to help create meals for them? Could you have conversations with people and just find out stories about their life? You see, this history is sad. We have to learn from this and then work towards making a more peaceful place for all of us to live together. Thank you so much for letting us be here today. As it's very somber, like to walk through and to think about the people that died here. But I also love what you're doing as a site to shed light on these people and celebrate their memories and talk about how we can honor them. Any last words from you? Why do you work here?
So I've always had an interest, particularly in Civil War history, but kind of coming in and, working here, kind of expanding to a more broader POW history, like you said, kind of trying to honor those who were held as prisoners of war, whether they have, passed on, or many of whom are still alive, particularly those, were held in conflicts like the Vietnam War. So kind of trying to honor them. And I think it's an incredible place, both because you have the prison site that honors those who died during the Civil War, but you also have the museum here that honors those who have passed on, but also those who are still living with our interpretations of prisoners that were held during the Vietnam conflict as well.
That's a great reason. And the word honor, so let's just end with that today. Whatever you create, whatever you decide to do to honor those who have served, share it with us. You can tag us on Twitter at Dacian92, hashtag Nat Park Challenge, and also tag the park. You're going to see that run across the bottom of your screen. Thanks again for having us here today. It's been a great eye-opening experience. We're adding this to our National Parks Expedition Challenge, and this is number 60. So congratulations for being number 60. Kids, we will see you next time at the National Parks Expedition Challenge. This is Dr. Drizzle, out.